Welcome back to all of you joining us here in our studios and around the globe. I'm Jonathan Panikoff. I'm the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. And I could not be more excited to have the opportunity to moderate this session's panel on China and the Middle East, especially given our panelists. Jonathan Fulton, who's on screen with us today, is an associate professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi and a non-resident senior fellow for the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative. Among a large variety of published works, he's the author of China's Relations with Gulf Monarchies, which has become the baseline standard for those seeking to understand China's relationship in the Gulf. Dawn Murphy, with me here in person today, is an associate professor of national security strategy at the National War College, which is part of National Defense University here in Washington, D.C. A prolific author in her own right, her latest book is entitled China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. And I'm just realizing, given the title of this conference, we may owe you royalties on that. Our final panelist is Andrea Ghiselli, who is an assistant professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University and the head of research of the TAC China Hub's China Med project. You'll find his research in a variety of journals. His latest book, Protecting China's Interests Overseas, Securitization and Foreign Policy, came out just a few years ago. Welcome to you all. A lot to address and not a lot of time, so let me get right to it if I could. Jonathan, you're sitting in the Middle East in Abu Dhabi right now. Give us a broad overview today, if you would, as to your sense of how China is seeing the region.
Well, first, Jonathan, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. Great to see you again. Great to see Dawn and Andrea. So I should stress first, I'm in the Middle East. I'm in Abu Dhabi. So Andrea probably is better equipped to talk about what folks in China are thinking because he's actually there. I do a lot of reading of what Chinese people are saying, and I'll start with a shameless plug. I host the China MENA podcast for the Atlantic Council, and a new episode dropped earlier today. I interviewed Andrea's colleague, Zhang Chuchu, who's a Middle East specialist at Fudan University. And the focus of the conversation was how are folks in China perceiving regional instability, everything that's happened since October 7th, how's it affecting China's approach to the region, interest in the region, and I can't recommend it highly enough. She gives a really great overview of China's interests and concerns, and I think it's a really good starting point for folks who want to know more about it. So just basically, I think if I'm looking at, giving a perspective from the region, looking at how what's been going on since the Hamas attack on Israel, the subsequent war, the Houthi attack on Red Sea shipping, how is this affecting China's position in the region? I think generally you look at three broad baskets. How does it affect China itself, China's domestic situation, particularly its political economy? How is it affecting China's engagement in the region? Is it reshaping or is it forcing a recalibration of how folks in Beijing are thinking about the region? And then the broader geopolitical, systemic, great power competition stuff, which of course is always the baseline of everything. So, just thinking about how it's probably affecting China. We all know China's been undergoing quite a bit of economic stress in recent years. This year it seemed much more acute with the real estate crisis, with high youth unemployment. If you are familiar, there's a website called Reading the China Dream where there's some translated articles of what Chinese people are writing about or thinking about. And the lead articles right now that have been translated, one is from the Beijing Review, which is just talking about how educated youth are pursuing blue-collar careers instead of chasing those elusive white-collar jobs, just because it's getting harder and harder to find them, and it's seen as kind of a waste of time to try to find that job. And the other one is talking about the don't buy crowd, as in B-Y. Just saying that, with the economy in the shape it's in, a lot of people are turning to a less consumerist lifestyle, more saving, living simply. I think it just speaks to some of the problems that China's facing economically right now. And I think probably there's a sense that instability in the Middle East could exacerbate that. the food and commodity prices were already affected by the war in Ukraine. Then we saw the shipping costs increasing a lot with the attacks on the Red Sea. If there were to be a broader Middle East conflict, if it actually brought in the principal actors in the region, then I imagine oil prices would spike high. And for China, where they import between 40 and 50% of its crude from the Middle East, that would be a very big concern. Beyond that, I think there's still a sense of the Middle East as a place of economic opportunity. I've written a lot about this, about how China looks at the region primarily in economic terms. It does literally billions of dollars of contracting. A lot of Chinese SOEs are very active in the region. Middle Eastern countries, vision development strategies align very neatly with China's Belt and Road Initiative and a lot of what its SOEs and construction firms are capable of doing. So I think there's still a sense of the region as an opportunity. I think there's also a sense, being here in Abu Dhabi, one of the centers of Middle Eastern capital, we've seen, especially last fall, early this year, a lot of visitors from China, representing companies, representing investment groups, representing law firms who are trying, working with different firms around China, looking for Gulf capital to work on joint investment projects. So I think there's also a sense of maybe flipping the narrative, where a lot of folks think of China coming and investing in the Middle East, and now they're saying, look, Middle East, we'd like you to invest in us as well. There was a story that I saw just this morning about work that, ground was broken on a petrochemical plant in Fujian province. And this is a joint project between a Fujian company and SABIC in Saudi, where the Saudis are up represent 51% of this. So, you are seeing that kind of engagement as well. Looking at the second basket, just how it's affecting China's view of the Middle East itself. Well, beyond the billions of dollars in trade I mentioned and investment and contracting, there's a huge Chinese expat population here. It's not really obvious. You'd have to be looking for it. But I've talked to a bunch of people about this recently. Everybody's trying to do the math. Nobody knows exactly. General estimate is about 500,000 people, 500,000 Chinese people living in the Middle East right now. A lot of that, most of that is in the Gulf, but you have to think that represents a pretty significant security concern if there were to be some kind of escalation here. We've seen since, hostility or the war broke out in Gaza, and since the Red Sea crisis, just the limitations on what China is able to do or willing to do in the region. There's always a sense in the U.S. that China could or should be doing more. People talk about the PLA support base in Djibouti as something that is a power projection. China refers to this as a supply base. It's meant to support its anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden. And I think we've seen a general reluctance of China to engage in this kind of stuff. So I think when they look at the Middle East, beyond the economic opportunities, I think they also look at the instability, something that could really threaten to undermine a lot of that. The final basket, the broader geopolitical realm, a lot of the stuff I've been reading from Chinese academics or Chinese journalism really looks at what's been happening since October 7th from a perspective of U.S. hegemony. What does this mean for U.S. capacity to act as a leading power in the Middle East? Does it still have the capacity to order the region? And I think there's a general sense that that's not the case. I think that might be early days. I think there's always a concern when you look at recent events. It's very easy to get caught up in the news cycle and anticipate the worst. Having lived in the Middle East since 2006, I've been through a lot of these cycles. And I don't think, I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I think things are not as dramatic as they necessarily seem right now, or at least in the long term. I think probably there's a tremendous desire among leading actors in the region to right the ship on this. All the narratives in the Middle East before October 7th were about de-escalation. Every leader in every country was talking only about development, only about building sustainable economies, only about creating new industries and new jobs for their young population. I think there's a sense that regional adventurism that was such a common feature post-Arab Spring was not getting the results anybody hoped for. So that leads me to hope, perhaps, again, perhaps naively, that some of the principal actors in the region are probably going to try to, ease the temperature a little bit. That said, China has rolled out a lot of alternative visions for how international politics would work if China had its preferences. A lot of these are based, are kind of, as I'm sure you've all been talking about with this Global South conference, a lot of it is trying to garner support from the Global South, right? Things like the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, these things that are saying China has a different approach to international politics and global governance. I think the war in Gaza and generally Western support, specifically US support for Israel, really feeds into this narrative for China. That said, I don't think it necessarily means that this region is ripe for the plucking. I think the Global South, first of all, where I live in the Gulf, I don't think too many countries identify as Global South members. I think the idea, that's often associated with developing countries, and the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis, I think believe that they're, I don't think they self-identify that way. I do believe that there's frustration with Western policy in the region. There's frustration with US policy in the region. There's frustration with what Israel's been doing, obviously. But I don't think that just necessarily results in countries bandwagoning with the Chinese vision. We saw during the G20 a few months ago when Prime Minister Modi talked about India as a leader of the Global South as well. And I think India is often underappreciated as an actor, especially here in the Gulf. So I think, in the broad geopolitical realm, obviously this looks like an opportunity right now, but I don't think it's as, I would urge caution to anybody who's going to base policy on immediate events, because I think things are pretty fluid here right now. I'll stop here. I know I'm really interested to hear what Don and Andrea have to say, so I'm going to try to talk less and listen more. Thanks, guys.
Jonathan, thanks for that overview. It actually is a great segue, especially your last point, bringing up where we were from October 7th. Don, talk to us a little bit about that, if you could. How has China's approach changed or materialized since the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel and the ensuing war that has happened? What clues do you think it's going to give us about Beijing's approach to the region in the future?
So Jonathan, thanks for having me here today. And I do need to start out just saying the views that I expressed today are my own. They don't represent the US government in any way. So I think the way I look at it is continuity more than change. And I think it's important to provide a little bit of context, especially for the audience that may not be as familiar with China's stance regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So China views events since October 7th as this Israel-Hamas war as a flare-up in the broader Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so I want to say a few words about what China's stance has been on that. During the Mao era, China was providing material support for the Palestinians, right? But since 1992, they've had robust state-to-state relations with Israel, as well as recognizing Palestine as a state since 1988. And at a high level, since 1997, they've essentially had a consistent stance regarding the Palestinians, including establishing a special envoy over 2 decades ago in 2002 to try to contribute to resolution of this conflict. So at a high level, their stance is they want to see a 2-state solution with an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as the capital, based on land for peace, based on pre-67 borders, and a cessation of Israeli settlements, right, in occupied territories. So at a high level, China sees the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as the core threat, or has, I think, for a very long time, seen that conflict as the core threat to peace and stability in the Middle East. And it has consistently, for decades, criticized Israel for what China considers to be Israel's disproportionate response, as well as violations of international law. It is important to keep in mind also, I would say, this Palestinian-Israeli conflict and China's Palestinian-leaning stance in that has been a centerpiece of its interactions and political dialogues with Arab states, for example, in cooperation forums and through other mechanisms. So China very much sees this as a longstanding principle, and I think there is quite a bit of continuity with there even from the Mao era, right? This is one kind of legacy from that. That said, since 1992, China has had strong state-to-state relations with Israel and a robust economic and political relationship. So since October 7th, if you look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you look at Zhang Jun, who's the UN representative from China, right? If you look at Zai Jun, who's the special envoy for the Middle East, if you look at Xi Jinping's statements, if you look at the behavior broadly, I would say there's been incredible consistency on that issue. So what has changed? One thing that has changed, I would say, is Israel's concerns regarding China's Palestinian-leaning behavior. Obviously, there's been a lot of concerns expressed from an Israeli perspective about China not criticizing Hamas explicitly for terrorist activity. That said, I do think it's important to look at that in historical context, that China has not in the past referred to Hamas as terrorists, right? Has not referred to the Palestinians, and is very careful in the ways in which it differentiates that. And although China doesn't frame it in this way in the current rhetoric, I think China still sees the Palestinians' use of violence as part of the national liberation struggle. And so that, compared to China's behavior that we've talked about in other regions, I do think this is one, real continuity with the Mao era. I also want to highlight that when we think about now and going forward, because you asked about clues going forward, right? So I think China's biggest concern right now is the escalation of what's happening in Israel with Gaza, turning into a much broader regional war, bringing in Hezbollah, bringing in the Houthi, bringing in Iran in a more formal way. I also think that China does not want to pick sides. And so this would be one case where obviously they're picking the Palestinian side. I mean, if this is a bit of a deviation in that way. But I think they don't want to be drawn into regional conflict. And I do think that although they have a Palestinian-leaning approach, given the ways in which they've been framing their critique, I do see indications that in the longer term, they would want to see their relations with Israel on the economic and political front go back to what it was before, to Jonathan's point. I think ultimately there's a continuity of interests and a desire for this to stabilize, and that China's interests in the region haven't changed, but they want to get past this conflict. I would also say that China is playing up the US role that I know we're going to talk about more. That absolutely is a dynamic. And China is using this as a way to consolidate its support within the global South more broadly. But again, I do think it's important that China's behavior hasn't changed, but maybe the world has changed around China.
I think that's a really helpful overview in terms of the Israel-Palestinian context here related to Beijing's thinking. You mentioned just here at the end the U.S. role, potential tensions there, something, Andrea, that there's been a lot of focus on the last few years between Washington and Beijing, and sitting here in Washington, even if you're not somebody focusing on China, you feel it on almost a daily basis for every other part of the world or every functional topic. Earlier this week, Andrea, you wrote something that caught my eye, and I want to read it for the audience. You said, when talking about the Middle East, you said the following, quote, "Whatever reputational success China may have garnered arises from Washington's self-inflicted strategic blunders and incoherent policies on issues from Palestine to Yemen. If Beijing appears to score so many important diplomatic points in this moment, it is because, regardless of its motivations, it is taking a stance that is not uniquely Chinese." Andrea, are you saying, is your view then that there's an overestimation as to how much the U.S. is factoring into China's decision-making and its approach to the Middle East? Walk us through your thinking and analysis on Beijing's decision-making itself, not just related to the post-October 7th environment, but more broadly in the region, if you could.
Sure. Okay. So just to clarify, this is op-ed in The National that I co-authored with my friend Mohammed al-Sudairi. So it's a result of both of us thinking. Anyways, the United States is definitely I would say, one of the most, if not the most, factor in how China approaches the Middle East. I think. But I think really the point that we, Mohammed and I, were trying to make in that specific article was actually not de-emphasizing the importance of the United States in Chinese decision making, but really a bit trying to say that if China now seems so much on the rise in the region, it's also because it's not really just about China, something that also Don was mentioning a moment ago. But what China is doing is not particularly unique. It's simply the world changed, and Chinese position are popular at the moment, at least in large parts of the world. Now, as to generally speaking, Chinese decision making and the role of the United States when it comes to the Middle East, I think there's been quite a lot of debate. Of course, it's very difficult really to understand how everything happens in Beijing and how every decision takes place, what factors are considered, which are not. That said, there's definitely, from what you can see from open source, or like Jonathan was saying, from articles written by Chinese scholars in the media or academic journals, I think it's possible to say there's been quite a lot of debate about what to do about the United States in the Middle East, meaning should there be a more open confrontation with the United States in the region? Should Beijing instead just keep a low profile, avoiding, again, the cost that would come from such a direct confrontation? Clearly, I believe that the events of the Hamas attack on Israel in October probably pushed Beijing to adopt a more to kind of seize the opportunity, to seize what it perceived as an opportunity to further blunt American influence in the region. Again, probably exploiting a bit what Mohammed and I wrote, that its position suddenly became very popular, and not just in the region, but also in other places of the world. So probably there's been that, let's say, Beijing approach has shifted toward, let's say, difficult to say more confrontation, but definitely more eager to exploit that opportunity. That said, it's important also to say that for a long time, there's also been some in China, some people in China that have been saying we should be careful, however, because in any case, the United States, even if is not as powerful as it used to be, it remains the most powerful extra-regional actor in the region, more than Russia, more than us, for sure. And so even though maybe it's not the hegemon anymore, it still has the capabilities to inflict substantial damage to our interests. And so, and especially as the relationship with Washington has deteriorated over the years, there's been a constant fear, you can see really in the articles, in what Chinese scholars have been writing, of a potential connection between the United States Middle East policy and its East Asia or Indo-Pacific policy. So more kind of coordinated strategy of containment as something that, of course, a more confrontation approach also Beijing side could have fueled and accelerated. With some, and I'm thinking about an article that was published not a long time ago. It was on Chinese blogs, but also in academic journals, written by Niu Xinchun, a very prominent expert in China, really kind of trying to discuss these different options and positions, and emphasizing how there was no really real choice, and not really easy choice, for Beijing, whether to keep a more low-key profile or just be more confrontational. But that said, again, I think for the moment, probably China will try to see as much as possible the opportunity that Hamas attack created, especially as it's clearly building its relations and strengthening the relations with Gulf countries. It seems to me that this event is not seen as it is seen as a short-term obstacle to trends that Beijing sees playing out in the region, those of distension and so on that also Jonathan mentioned earlier. But in the long run, it seems to me that Chinese analysts expect things to go back on track. It will take a bit of time, maybe not as smoothly as many expected, especially after the rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians. But nonetheless, something that the situation probably will recover at a certain point. And if that happens, we diminish the American influence in the region, even better. I don't think that anyone will be sad about that in Beijing. But they will definitely keep on looking at Washington moves. And I think this is quite clear if we look at Beijing's reaction to the Houthis attacking the Red Sea. They're very firm in saying this is not about the Houthis per se, this is about, again, Gaza, the Palestinians, and Israel in the first place. So we cannot just address it directly. It should be the United States first changing course. And so I think they're going to push in that direction. And this is clearly, again, evidence of how much the United States and the bilateral relations with Washington are so important in determining China's approach to the region.
Thank you very much. I think, Jonathan, let me turn back to you because Andrea laid out, I think, a fairly thoughtful analysis in terms of China's goals and opportunities. But let me ask you a bit about impact, if I could. You recently wrote something that also caught my eye. You said, referring to tensions specifically along the Red Sea, and this was for us, for the Atlantic Council, you said, China's inaction exposes the self-interested and transactional nature of its position in the Middle East. Regional actors need international leadership in the Red Sea, and China has not offered it. Jonathan, as Arab states, as Gulf states are looking at it, if China hasn't offered that leadership now, how does that alter or otherwise impact the relationship and Arab states' views of China's engagement in the region going forward, in your estimation?
Yeah, so I think, Andrea mentioned the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, and, that was kind of the crown jewel, but it was also, surrounded by a lot of really big events that signaled a bigger role for China in the region, Now, for Don and Andrea and I, we've been watching this stuff for a very long time, so it wasn't really a surprise. But when Xi Jinping went to Riyadh in December 22, I think it caught a lot of people off guard to see just how big of a deal that was being portrayed. That was followed by the Raisi visit. President Raisi from Iran went to Beijing 2 months later. Then there was the Saudi-Iran rapprochement. There was the SCO and BRICS ascension for a lot of Gulf countries. There was a lot of headlines, a lot of analysis talking about, there's a vacuum in the Middle East that the U.S. is leaving and China's filling it. And I'm always very uncomfortable with that kind of hyperbole because it just seems silly, especially if you live here and see what China's doing and what the U.S. is doing and the tremendous gap. I mean, I remember about this time last year talking to a Middle East expert from China who was visiting here for the first time since 2019, pre-COVID. And I thought I would defend him by referring to China as a second-tier power in the Middle East, and he laughed and said, "We're like a third or fourth-tier power," So I think, but again, with all of the issues with the U.S.-Middle East relations being what they are, the U.S. domestic political situation, which dominates the way a lot of people think about things, just this sense. Countries in the Gulf saw China coming in, and I think there was a sense of an emerging rising power that they wanted to develop a really strong relationship with. And all of these events that I just referred to were pieces of that puzzle that made that picture look a lot more clear. Now, in my earlier remarks, I referred to these vision development programs that you see around the Middle East. These are fundamental to what every country is trying to do. Every country in the Gulf. If you ask any Saudi any question, the answer is Saudi Vision 2030. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. This is existential for Saudi. They need to create a post-hydrocarbon economy, and that requires stability. And I think that explains why they reached out to Iran and why they've improved relations with Turkey and why they, reached out to Syria shortly after the Iranian rapprochement. It's why they're trying to end the war in Yemen. All of this stuff is an attempt to create a more stable situation so that FDI is going to flow into the kingdom in a way that supports the vision that international investors and international companies and international capital and talent are going to come into the country. And the same is true here in the Emirates. It's true in Qatar. It's true across the region. Now, the reason why I bring this up is I think there was a sense, especially in Saudi, and this didn't come, I haven't been in Saudi for about a year, but talking to people in Riyadh, there was a sense that folks in Saudi were disappointed. These Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping, this more aggressive Houthi behavior undermines what Saudi's trying to do. And there was a sense that China was going to contribute to stopping this, that China was going to be a more active partner. And when China wasn't, I wouldn't expect China to join, a US, UK-led maritime mission. I don't think anybody expects to see that, but I still think that a lot of folks were hoping that there would be more of a response from China. And when there wasn't, I think leaders, well, I shouldn't say leaders, I think just actors in general were thinking, what kind of great power are you if you can't step in and help out your partners in a time of need? So I understand the logic that Andrea was talking about, but I also think here in the region, the logic is, it's more than peace through development that we need. We need peace. We need hard security approaches to this stuff as well. We need extra regional actors who can supply that when our capacities or our resources can't on their own. So I think that leads to, I don't think, maybe disappointment is the wrong word, but I think just a reconsideration to think, China's told us time and again that they don't want to replace the US. And I think a lot of people would say, that's a normal thing for a rising power to say. Why antagonize the hegemon, right? But I think it's genuine. I don't think that China sees itself as coming into this region and playing a major security role and trying to order the region. And I think actors, again, like I said, probably weren't disappointed, but just kind of more clear-eyed, saying, this is what we can expect. And, if it's a country where you get a lot of investment, do a lot of trade, and do a lot of contracting, and, that's the extent of it, then fine. But I think it also just was a moment where people maybe said, that's who China is here.
Don, Jonathan talked about the role that China's actually willing to play. One of the places that we have seen, I'm trying to pick up the ball at least at the very end of the challenge, was mediating a resolution between the Saudis and Iranians to get back to some sort of cold diplomatic détente, I'll say. But about 10 months ago, you wrote something that I thought was quite interesting. You said, although there's been an uptick in the highly visible nature of China's activities in the Middle East over the last year, China's efforts to mediate disputes in the region are not new. The world may just now be noticing China as a mediator, but it has worked to contribute to peace and security in the Middle East and resolve what it perceives as hotspot issues for over 20 years. In your earlier remarks, you mentioned the special envoy it's had for 20 years. Does China believe its efforts have actually been successful overall? March is a much more clear example, but aside from March, have they been successful? Have they been worthwhile in China's mind? And especially in a post-October 7th world where the conflict is greater than it's been in a number of years, what role does China think it's going to play when it comes to mediation?
Right. And so when I made those comments, as you said, I was referring to the special envoy, also referring to 2016. They had a special envoy that was started to try to contribute to resolution of the Syrian civil war. And then, as you said, the Saudi Arabia, Iran, right. And then even right after the Saudi-Iran deal, there was this reinvigorated kind of rhetoric regarding wanting to contribute to resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I think having a desire to mediate and seeing a role for themselves in mediating and actually having success are two separate issues. But I do think that they conceptualize themselves as being able to play a unique role among great powers, in that in many of these conflicts that are relevant in the region, they have positive relations with all of the relevant actors, whether that be states or even through some of the mechanisms that were talked about yesterday on the conference, as far as through the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party, having relations with non-state actors such as Hezbollah and other groups that are involved in these processes. That I think that they see themselves as uniquely positioned in the longer term of wanting to contribute more to peace and security, not by having unilateral unilateral military presence, or as Jonathan's describing, not playing the security role that the U.S. does, but more of a mediator. But I do think that they're realistic in the current conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think they don't see a role in actually mediating that until we're past the current conflict and it's more of a normal Palestinian-Israeli conflict resolution mechanism going forward. So you brought up the only real successful quote-unquote example would have been the Saudis and the Iranians, but as you are well aware, they came in quite late in that process. I think what's most interesting in that case is the fact that Saudi and Iran chose to highlight China's role in the process and open up that opportunity for China to play that type of role in the future.
Speaking of Iran, Andrea, let me ask you this, because we saw Beijing relatively recently go to the Iranians, talk to them about the Houthis and whether there was potential help they could get in helping to, if not stop, slow Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Doesn't seem to have had that much of an impact, at least not yet. What's driving Chinese thinking, and how is Beijing thinking about how much they can push regional states, especially Iran, in order to ensure Chinese interests that exist in the Middle East ultimately are not undermined?
This is $1 million question, I fear. I think many people have been discussing actually how much leverage Beijing has toward Iran. Of course, Iran depends much on China from an economic perspective, although, for example, me and my colleagues at the China Project have been following for a while Iranian media, and it's clear that also Iranians have quite a few, let's say, they're not that happy about their relationship with Beijing. At least some believe that they're too dependent on them, and so far and so on. It's also on the Chinese side. From time to time, you see, of course, it's not a debate that happens. It's very easy to follow, at least in open sources. But you see sometimes, from time to time, discussions about actually the question that you just asked on, how much they think they have influence, how much successful they can be in the region, including how much influence they have vis-a-vis the Iranians. And it seems to me a lot of times the answer is not much. Some say, it seems that recently our initiative have gained some traction in the region, but it's not really because of our initiatives, but because the region has changed. Simply the demands coming from regional policymakers made our initiatives more appealing to them rather than being something that comes from us. And a bit the same thing is the discussion about Iran. Iran is an important partner. They have, of course, very important economic relations, but really difficult to tell how much influence we have because, well, they're so dependent on us, and also who knows what they really, if they're given other opportunities, other choices, they will actually listen to us. But in any case, I think at the moment, even if they had that much leverage on Iran to influence Iranians' behavior, I think they would be more on the cautious. They would stay on the cautious side. I don't think they would, in any case, push the Iranians too much, because in any case, Iran is a too important regional partner, especially and for a long time, Chinese scholars have been looking at it as a country that's many problems, that is also a bit fragile. I don't think they want to push too much in any case. And again, I think this also should be seen as part of Beijing's constant efforts to say, this is not about Iran. This is not about the Houthis. Again, let's keep the focus on Israel and Gaza. And so I think there are a mix of things then, right? There is a mix of maybe they don't have so much influence, and maybe they do not necessarily want to use it at full. And I think this also, we're thinking, Jonathan mentioned the fact that, of course, China is an important trading nation. Of course, it also has interest at stake. But at the same time, if we look back in time, like 2008, 2007, when there were the pirates in the in the Gulf of Aden. It took a while for Beijing to react, really. And so this to say they're quite tolerant in any case to such kind of economic cost. So, they don't have that kind of motivation in a way. They're tolerant to the economic cost. They want to keep the focus on Israel. And at the same time, again, there is the $1 million question, how much real influence they have on the Iranians, all in all. So difficult to tell, but I wouldn't expect them to push Iran too hard, even if they could. Let's put it this way.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let me take the little bit of remaining time we have to turn to some audience questions, if I could. Dawn, maybe I'll start with you, given some of your previous comments here today. There's two questions about largely on the same topic. I'm going to combine them a bit. It says, do people in the Middle East and Global South see the contradictions between China's support for Palestinian statehood and its repression of similar aspirations in Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong? And then the other part I'll add on to this is also related to the Palestinians. The part of this is there China's approach here, at least in part, a reflection of capitalizing on the mood of the Global South that was discussed yesterday?
Right. And so I'll keep my comments brief. This is a very large topic, right? But as far as Palestinians versus the situation in Xinjiang, I think at this point, obviously we don't have a lot of detailed polling data to really tell us exactly how people feel about this. But at least what I've seen in my own research is I think China has gotten a lot of traction in their narratives with Arab states in particular regarding Xinjiang, right? For a number of reasons, including framing it as terrorism. I'm not saying that is, it's exaggerated from a Chinese perspective, but framing it as terrorism, really downplaying the human rights aspect, the fact that Uyghurs are not ethnically Arab, the fact that China is in many ways the predominant economic partner of many Arab countries. I think it's kind of overdetermined in certain ways. But what I've seen more recently is, I think part of why there's traction is that China more and more is framing this issue about Xinjiang as something the US is using as part of great power competition. And I think in a number of countries, at least among leadership, because of concerns regarding the US role, because of coming from a post-colonial type of environment, I think there's a bit more receptivity to that narrative. But what I've seen over time is more and more traction and having more proactive statements coming out from the Gulf Cooperation Council, from Arab states, even from the Palestinians, about differentiating what's happening in Xinjiang, versus other human rights issues. So I think it's going the other direction. I mean, is there a disconnect? Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that disconnect is perceived in that way within the region.
Jonathan, let me turn to you quickly. There's a question here. Has the failure of the Arab Springs diminished the appeal of democracy and thus enhanced China's appeal?
Oh, the failure of the Arab Spring diminished the appeal of democracy. There's been a lot of stuff in democracy since that time that's also added to that. So I live and I teach political science in the UAE, which is far from a democracy. And when I talk to my students, which we're actually doing today in class, we were talking about democratization. They're very, very aware of the political system they live in, its shortcomings and its strengths. When we talk about democracy, the first thing they say, and apologies to our American audience, but they say we see what's happening in the U.S. with Congress and with this presidential election, and we don't want that. It looks very chaotic. Their experience with the Brits means that they also look at the referendum for Brexit, and they say, that's what democracy does. You get people that are making bad decisions, and then you get political chaos. So I wouldn't say that the Arab Spring really contributes to it so much as just a sense that maybe democracy isn't the right tool for every job. And I think that's where China actually is able to get some traction in the region, because they say, look, is it the means of the end? Do you want governance or do you want a system? And China will say, look at what we were prior to the reform era. Look how underdeveloped our country was. Look how weak economically we were, politically we were. We addressed development issues. We focused on strengthening our country, and we have very good governance now. Now, again, it's good governance if you're on one side of it. If you're on another side, you might dispute that. But I think that message resonates in a lot of Arab countries, a lot of Middle Eastern countries that would say, we would love to have that kind of economic reform without political reform. And if China's got the secret sauce, if they can tell us how to achieve economic reform and good governance without democracy, mashallah, give me that every time. So I don't think it's really about, post-Arab Spring stuff. I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to it. And I do think it's one place where China's narrative is met with a fair bit of enthusiasm around the region.
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Let me take a moment to thank our three fantastic panelists for what I thought was a truly illuminating conversation. We'll be breaking for lunch here at the council, but we'll resume at 12:45 with this afternoon's keynote speaker, Michael Schiffer, the Assistant Administrator for Asia at USAID. We look forward to seeing you then. For myself and all of the panelists, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.